start over here. Yes, sir.
I'm nobody. I'm being a 4-year-old man. Lived and worked all over the world. Have you ever lived in an Islamic country?
No, I have not.
I have. Have you ever faced a terrorist? Face to face?
Face to face, no.
I have. Have you studied? You trivialize so many things. Sharia. Are you familiar with, have you studied Sharia yourself?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell me one of the simplest rules in Sharia? It's how you go to the bathroom.
Okay. Can you actually just, it would help, I think, if you just asked your question that you want to ask instead of making statements.
Ask a question. You talked about tequila.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the ketone?
Do you have a question, sir? What is your question?
My question
I'll be
is-
glad to answer it.
Okay. My question is, are you naive? Or are you lazy as a scholar? Or are you just patently dishonest? Because you have trivialized so much. To those of you who might be Muslim in here, I say, Salam alaikum. I wish you well. I lived amongst you. But to trivialize and say that Islamophobia is irrational, you do not do our country or yourself. I would be happy at my expense to come to your college. I'm nobody, but I would be happy to debate you at your college at any time you want to set it up. Because from what I can see, you don't know much about Islam.
Okay, I'm sorry, there was not a question there, and it's hard for me to respond to that.
Yes, there was a question. Have you really studied Islam?
Yeah.
Have you been, are you naive, or are you lazy, or are you just dishonest?
Okay, so you're hurling insults and you're putting a question mark after them. And the question is, yes, I've studied this, and I've studied Islam, I've studied Islamophobia, which is actually not the same thing. There's a bit of a difference between the study of those two things. I know many Muslims, sir, and you tried to compliment Muslims here before you turned around and gave them a backhanded compliment, I guess. The idea that there's no such thing as Islamophobia or Islam is sort of dangerous is what it sounds like you were saying. You're asking me to believe that the Muslims who are part of this community, and many have been a part of this community for a long time, are somehow a threat to you? No, sir. No, sir. I will stand here. I will stand here and defend.
That's what you are suggesting.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm not suggesting that, sir.
You are suggesting that
You've had your opportunity. You've had your opportunity. Next question, please.
You go.
It's hard to follow that, I know.
All right, so I guess I'll try.
Sure.
Can you speak more about, quote, political and imperial ambitions of the professional Islamophobia, as you put it, and its relation to, I mean, I don't really have a word for this, but I think like the best words that have been said about it, like the kind of theory that's been proposed, is a clash of civilizations, you feel me? So there's this dude who's actually a big fan of the guy coming on Wednesday. This is a quote from him. He says, like, he's one of the top 2 or 3 experts in the world, and I guess the other 2 or 3 are the ones you suggested, on this great war in which we're fighting against fundamental Islam. And this dude's also kind of like a big proponent of civilizational jihad, and his name's Steve Bannon. And he's an architect of what has been quote-unquote called the Muslim ban, although it's very much an anti-Arab ban, because in its first iteration, it was really much subjected only to Arab nations, when, in fact, this same ban, when in fact there's Muslim countries in South Asia and all around the world, right, whatever. So it's a really anti-Arab ban, and where are we right now geopolitically, seems to me, like the Middle East, as we kind of deemed it in the West, the Middle East. So I just wondered if you had anything to say about professional Islamophobia and its political relationship to what might be called clash of civilizations theory.
Okay, so the question was about political Islam, or is it about
No, professional Islamophobia.
professional Islamophobia and the clash of civilizations?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you have this theory of the clash of civilizations that emerged in academic circles in the early 90s with Samuel Huntington's article, Clash of Civilizations, which had a question mark at the time. Then he wrote a book and took question mark out, so it was more certain that that's what was happening, right? This notion that as we move into the end of the 20th century, into the 21st century, some of the political ideologies and differences that separated civilizations at the time were going to be replaced with things like religious ideologies. So Islamic civilizations and Western civilizations were going to be engaged in an inherent sort of clash, right? And then the idea was that this was going to shape a lot of foreign policy. There are very few academic scholars who buy in at all to this idea of a clash of civilizations, and the list goes on and what's problematic with it, not least of which is this idea that there are these distinct civilizations that are somehow blocked, that have pure boundaries, right? Western civilization has had no influences from Islamic civilizations, which is just historically false, historically inaccurate. These are fluid boundaries, if they're boundaries at all. That being said, it has had a lot of currency. It had a lot of currency during the War on Terror, this idea that they hate us, they hate our values, and oftentimes making very sweeping statements about Muslims generally speaking. It's also what's interesting to me in the context of this industry, to bring it back to that part of your question, is that what does Osama bin Laden and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller have in common? They all believe in the clash of civilizations. Their worldview is rooted in this either-or, stark contrast between the West and Islam, and there's no gray area, there's no nuance, and there's no need to bother with the political correctness of doing that. And you can find those strong statements from extremists in Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and you can also find it in this industry. They actually look at the world in very, very similar ways, without nuance, without context, and they want it. They don't just look at it that way, they want the clash of civilizations. It helps with recruiting for ISIS, and it helps with recruiting for the professional Islamophobia industry, and that's why we have to be very careful about the kind of credence we give to such a theory. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Frame this question right away. So I guess one of the biggest issues I personally have studied the Kurds especially. I've always seen one of the biggest issues being the dealing with rights of women in Muslim countries.
Sure.
It just seems like to me that the differences that Muslim countries have between and Western countries have dealing with women, it just seems completely polar opposite. I mean, maybe I'm falling into a little bit of this like belief in clash of Western civilizations, but even the Kurdish people I know, they usually are like lauded as being like the best towards women. There's tons of issues with honor killings and dealing with rapes of women not going treated, not being prosecuted by law. I just guess I'm asking you, like, how do you think the West and Islam can kind of like, Western Muslim countries can kind of come together on women's issues, or like how you think we should like treat Muslim countries that treat women so poorly, and how do you think like this kind of plays into the whole Islamophobia that's kind of around? Because that's one thing that definitely scares me, is just seeing like even women in like British countries, in UK and America, like just seeing the hijab on, it still kind of scares me to see women kind of think they need to be in this cloth, covering their entire bodies out of some religious devotion.
Okay. Okay. It's a big question, but a fair one, right? Because the study of Islamophobia and calling attention to it doesn't mean we don't talk about some very difficult challenges that people who identify as Muslim might face either here at home or in other parts of the world, and women's rights is certainly one of them. This is not a substitute or a way to avoid those kind of difficult conversations. And I think the way not to slip into Islamophobia is always to be very specific. Are you talking about all Muslim women around the world? Are you talking about certain countries? Are you talking about certain contexts? Are you talking about certain practices? And which practices are we dealing with? So if the most common one I usually get in a context like this is women in Saudi Arabia can't drive. Problem. You and I can agree that's our problem. Criticizing that is not Islamophobic. Making an assumption that because that's true in Saudi Arabia, therefore it must be true in Indonesia, or now that's problematic, right? Whether we call it Islamophobic yet, I don't know. But it's starting to slide in that direction, right? Because you're starting to make assumptions more broadly about a lot of people, and that's very challenging. So it's always best to be specific in terms of the country, in terms of the context, in terms of the practice you're dealing with. Second, it's also good to make sure you understand the other perspective. Hijab is a good example. I know many Muslim women, have many Muslim women who are friends who don't have that interpretation of the hijab that I think you articulated. And I think it's our responsibility in the majority population to take that seriously, that Muslim women can articulate their own understanding of who they are and what that means for them, as opposed to me saying, here's what your hijab must mean to you. Right? That to me is what becomes problematic. And there's lots of writing on this from Muslim women and Muslim feminists included, but Muslim women more broadly speaking, calling attention to whether or not women in Western societies in terms of dress are as liberated as we might think. I mean, we have a lot to talk about in terms of clothing, in terms of body image, in terms of messages sent to women in the United States that they would say does not necessarily make them see Western women as liberated, right? But it comes from a similar source, some form of patriarchy. And then let's be clear also when we are making some assumptions that are there in part because we don't know the full facts. Two examples, education. Literacy levels for women in a country like Yemen are quite low. Is it okay to call attention to that? Absolutely. Absolutely. Women also make up the majority of university students in a number of Middle Eastern countries, right? Is it fair to call attention to that too? Does that complicate the image that we're working with here? Heads of state. Let's see, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Turkey, if we count the prime minister, Mauritius, which is not a Muslim majority state, but has a Muslim woman as head of state now. That's 5 countries I can think of that have had Muslim women become head of state. And you know where I'm going with that, right? Okay. But it doesn't mean we can't draw attention to or engage in critical debate about lack of opportunity that Muslim women might experience in certain contexts politically as well, right? But a lot of what Islamophobia does, in my opinion, is that it distracts women, Muslim women, right? So what do we don't have to do then? If we're focusing on Muslim women suffering only from lack of women's rights, human rights, we don't have to turn around and talk about gender in the United States. If we talk about all those violent Muslims, we don't have to talk about the other sources of violence, which I gave you data on here in the United States, right? And that's what a lot of bigotry does, in my opinion. I followed Toni Morrison on this, who many decades ago talked about racism as a form of distraction. It's a distraction in the sense that the people who are the target of it, that have to constantly defend themselves, their humanity, their contributions, their full personhood. But it's also a distraction because of those of us in the majority population are not also engaging in self-critical reflection. So as long as we can talk about gender without negating the need for self-critical reflection on our end, then I think we have a better chance of not crossing that line into Islamophobia. Thank you.
So obviously Robert Spencer is the kind of person who thrives on much more of an attention and a platform and makes money off of having this platform. So I'm wondering here in the context of Gettysburg College and the premises of this controversy, what's a better way to engage with Spencer? Is it to not go to his event, protest it outside, or is it to go to his event and engage like we're engaging with you?
Okay. Yeah. Because I'm trying to think if I were here on Wednesday, what would I be doing at 7 o'clock on Wednesday? In a moment, I might turn that question around just a bit, but it's a fair question. In some ways, Spencer has already won in his mind. He's going to be here, right? So whether you show up or not, he'll make that work for his advantage. Whether you protest or not, he will make that work for his advantage. He's got narratives about leftist college students anyway. Many of you are probably going to fit into that narrative, whatever you do, right? So maybe then turning this question a bit, maybe we can ask the question of what should we be doing in the community in relation to our Muslim neighbors here? What would be a most benefit to them? And I can't answer that question for you, actually. I think you have to turn to your fellow classmates and staff and faculty members who are Muslim. What do they need at this time? What would be most helpful to them as allies, as friends, as people who work alongside them in a small religious community here on campus that is probably feeling quite targeted right now? What would be best for them? Because Spencer, one way or the other, you're there, you're not there. You have a rally, you don't have a rally. He will twist it to fit his narrative. But maybe in the end, the most important people to worry about not Robert Spencer, but your Muslims here and who are part of your community. Robert Spencer, Todd Green, we're not part of your community, so they matter more. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much for coming.
Sure.
Especially on such short notice. That was incredible. I have a soapbox and I love soapbox. I'm a women, gender, and sexuality studies major
Okay.
and a passionate advocate of women's rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I just like to say, where's our gentleman from the first question? Oh, hi. That I don't think that anyone in the same position as me who's truly progressive would have our movement co-opted in the name of Islamophobia. Two-part question. With your expertise, do you think that an institution like Gettysburg College, with the self-proclaimed value of the worth and dignity of all human beings, has any business bringing Robert Spencer here? And do you think that people who provide him with what you called a receptive audience, particularly in light of your comparisons to anti-Semitism in the early part of the 20th century, will look back and think that they were on the wrong side of history?
Thank you. And I see those two connected, so I hope I get at the core of both of them. I defend Robert Spencer's First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. I do. He is free to write what he wants to write, blog about what he wants to blog about, come to speak on what he wants to speak about, and assuming he doesn't exceed the parameters of that freedom of speech, and all countries have some parameters on it, including the United States. Incitement to violence, libel, things along those lines. Assuming he doesn't transgress those boundaries, then I will defend his right to freedom of speech and freedom to articulate his hatred. He's free to hate, and he's free to articulate his hate and why he has it. Does he have a constitutional right to come to this campus? My own opinion on that is no, he doesn't. This is a private college, and you can make decisions about your values. But it's tricky. I get the freedom of speech concern, and that is fair. It's fair for those of you who've been asking that question, who want to be on the right side of this, and that question has been central to you. I get that. I do. As I've been mentioning, and you alluded to in your question, that is just not the only issue on the table. If you make it the only issue on the table, then it seems like the decision is easy. If you actually start to think about the larger context in which this is happening, then we got bigger problems to concern ourselves with. My own opinion, this may be an unpopular opinion, but I recognize that I'm in unpopular business, is this, that Gettysburg College, my home institution, Luther College, other colleges like ours, we need to get together and figure out within our communities and communicating with others as well, what our values are, what our commitments are, what do we prioritize when making decisions in terms of our values about who to invite on the campus. And freedom of speech and diversity perspectives is a good one, for one of them, and that's in your mission statement. And it's clear that was a factor in this decision, and I respect that a lot. I really do. Dignity of the human being is another thing that's in your mission statement. Robert Spencer doesn't quite fit that criteria, if you ask me, right? But in the end, I can't make that decision for you as a community. You have to do that on your own. And I hope that that's what emerges from this, is a conversation about who are we, what are our commitments, and what standards do we set when it comes to the platforms we provide for any speaker. Because it's good to set standards. The thing is, in this moment in our history, you can say anything about Muslims. The bar is, I can't imagine it getting any lower. There is nothing wrong with this college raising the bar and saying, if you want to speak on our campus, you have to meet some fundamental criteria in terms of academic inquiry.
That's right.
In terms of... And you have to meet moral standards too. I frame this as a moral question, right? It is a moral question. And you have to meet certain moral standards, which you, again, not me, and not Robert Spencer, are the ones to determine. And in the end, whether it's Todd Green, whether it's Robert Spencer, whether it's Jane or John Doe, whether it's Donald Trump or Barack Obama, Kim Kardashian, I don't care. Any potential or prospective speaker who wants to come speak and have the honor and the privilege of speaking on this campus, that's what I consider this. I don't consider this an inalienable right. I didn't come out of the womb earning the inalienable right one day of speaking at this campus. There are over 300 million people who will never speak on this campus. You have not disenfranchised them. You have not undermined their constitutional rights. You can't extend an invitation to that many people. I don't think the college can handle that crowd, right? You have to make decisions. You have to use your own criteria for that. I personally think your mission statement is a great foundation for this. It's a wonderful mission statement. I think it's a good guide in this conversation to be had. But in the end, may Robert Spencer and may Todd Green endeavor to meet your criteria, as opposed to you having to bend down and lower your standards to meet ours. And if that means I don't qualify, then I don't get the invitation, so be it. If Spencer doesn't qualify, so be it. We will survive. We will still have freedom of speech. But may we endeavor to meet your standards. And don't apologize for that as a community. We need the communities, we need colleges to raise those standards and give an example to the rest of this country of what it means to have respectful, honest dialogue and discourse where there are some standards of intellectual and moral integrity.
So, first again, thank you for coming. And my question is very similar to the student before me, but broadens it a bit. So, in my classes, we've studied how various initiatives have sought to essentially fund muckraking and smear campaigns about things like green energy, renewable energy, things like that, environmental studies major. But what strikes me as unique about this institution that you're talking about, professional Islamophobia, is that they are seeking to, for lack of a better word, this may be an extreme paraphrasing of your words, vilify members of our community who are our friends, our neighbors, our professors, the people we live with. And they seem to have pretty decent funding from your numbers. My question to you is, from your understanding, your professional study of this institution, what is the best response for individuals, communities, or another institution to combat the message that these people, these three people and their organizations are proponing in our communities?
Okay, the practical question, right, is, how do we respond to all this? And not only the more egregious form of this, but maybe more broadly Islamophobia, right? What is the best way to counter this? You actually, it's pretty decent setup because I cut out a slide for the sake of time, and I'll just go to this slide. And how do we build better relationships with Muslims in the United States? Which is how do you counter the message of this industry? How will this industry have much more difficulty in the work it does? And what I'm going to give you is a blueprint. I mean, we could talk tactics if you want to, but I want to present a larger blueprint, I think, for how to think through this, how you can generate your own ideas, and some principles that will guide you in that. And the principles I'm going to draw on come from the late biblical studies scholar, a guy named Christopher Stendahl, who is also a bishop in the Church of Sweden, a Lutheran bishop. Over his long career, along the way, as he interacted with many different people of different religious traditions, developed sort of a set of rules, or rules of engagement, if you will, when you're interacting with people of a different religious tradition, and what sort of creates a solid foundation for healthy relationships, which clearly we don't have right now. Okay. And so these are the three principles coming from him that I think actually would still serve us well. The first one is this idea of developing holy envy, that when you encounter someone of a different religious tradition, in this case, if I am interacting with someone who's Muslim and trying to learn from them, that I try to seek something in the way that they understand their tradition, in the way they understand Islam. that I'm envious of, that I find awe-inspiring. That this is what he means by holy envy. But it's in another tradition, though, right? You're envying something there. And an example of this might be George W. Bush in an iftar dinner in 2002, expressing his admiration for the practice of fasting during Ramadan, which is not something he does. He's not a Muslim. And fasting is not something he does, or at least he wasn't doing it back then, I don't know about now. But he was inspired by how fasting grounded Muslims during the month of Ramadan, how it sort of made them more aware of their neighbors and their needs in terms of their bodily needs, in terms of poverty and things along those lines. It was clearly a source of inspiration for him, of envy. Or Barack Obama, who talks about the call to prayer as something he finds awe-inspiring. Right? That's sort of what we're getting at here. But you have to develop holy envy, you have to be in a learning position. Spencer and Geller are not in a learning position. They're telling you what Islam is. I'm actually trying not to tell you what Islam is. I haven't given you a long lecture on all of the intricacies of Islamic history, trying to position us so that we learn from Muslims themselves, which Spencer does not want you to do. Develop holy envy, you have to start listening. Learn from practitioners, not from enemies. Right? If you want to learn about Judaism, are you going to invite an anti-Semite on the campus? I hope you rethink that. That's not how you learn about Judaism. If you want to learn about Catholicism, you don't learn it from someone who's anti-Catholic. If you want to learn about evangelical Protestant Christianity, you don't learn about it from their enemies. And if you want to learn about Islam, you don't learn about it from Robert Spencer. Learn from practitioners, not from enemies. And then what kind of ideas can this college generate that furthers that goal, right? And finally, don't compare their worst to our best. This is very common. This is what Spencer does all the time. The worst egregious examples of extremism and terrorism in Islam, and let's compare it with Martin Luther King. And maybe ask the question, well, where is the Martin Luther King of Islam? As if there aren't many peacemakers and people who are building bridges who are Muslim in the world today. It's just that most of us don't know about it because we're not literate on this stuff, right? But compare apples to apples. If you want to engage in critical conversations about violence among Muslim extremists, do the same with Christians. And if you want to talk about peacemakers in Christianity and then move to Islam, talk about peacemakers in Islam. And if you don't know who they are, learn. All three of these require you to stop telling Muslims who they are and what their religion means to them, which is incredibly naive and ignorant and offensive in my opinion. And most Christians in this country would not put up with a Muslim coming into a church and telling them what Christianity believes. Most Jews would not put up with a Christian coming into a synagogue and telling them what Judaism means and believes. Why should Muslims have to put up with that? What they do.
So I wanted to ask two questions, and they're both kind of the same thing. When people in the U.S. Generally talk about Islam and Muslims, they generally kind of put their views, they form their views and talk about the Middle East in particular, while there are millions of other Muslims throughout the world, specifically in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and those are, like Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. Why do you think that the concept of the Middle East and the people from the Middle East are who Americans think of when they think of Muslims? And then the second question was about the concept that you made, and the point you made earlier about Islamophobia directed towards people who people think are Muslim, but like are Sikhs. Because I have a very good friend from high school. His last name is Asadi. However, he's a Baha'i. And he's from Persia. He's from Iran. His parents fled during the revolution. And he has, the very stereotypical complexion, and he says his family's from Iran. And then people will like during the times right after 9/11, his parents were asked, or kind of berated for being Muslim. However, they decided as a family not to tell people that they were not Muslim, because in the Baha'i faith it's pretty huge that you don't like put down other religions. They basically think that Muslims are Baha'i and so are Christians and everyone else.
Right.
But why do you think that, you know, even, because I assume at the shooting at the Sikh temple, they told them they were not Muslim, most likely during the shooting, or
No.
no?
There was no conversation between the shooter and
Okay.
whether that would have made a difference, I don't know,
Okay.
in terms of the man's mental health state or whatever, yeah.
So do you think it's simply ignorance of the religion, or do you think it's that they are told and they don't believe, or that just every, you know, Arab
Yeah.
person is
Yeah, I think I get at your question, and they are related. You know, I think the idea that Muslim equals someone from the Middle East, or Muslim equals Arab particularly, right, is both because of long-standing political interest in the Middle East, and particularly in the 20th century, the heightened interest in that, and the television and media coverage that comes with it. It also has to do with Hollywood and television and other, you know, media informs the way we view Islam and view Muslims. This is not just CNN though, this is Homeland, this is, you know, most movies, right? And there's a great documentary by a guy named Jack Shaheen called Real Bad Arabs, R-E-E-L, Real Bad Arabs. He traces these stereotypes and negative stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims all the way back to silent movies. I mean, this is not just, you know, the past couple of years, this is the lecherous chic, right, the harems. This has been around for a very, very long time. So we inherit these prejudices. Much of how we see what we think of as reality is coming from a lot of different media sources. So that's part of that question. I think that the thrust of your second question, if I'm interpreting it correctly, it is really what's driving even this perception of some people who are perceived to be Muslim and then targeting them, right? This is not someone like, first, you know, where are you from, what religion are you, before I decide whether to harass you or not. It's because Islamophobia is also a form of racism. It's a difficult conversation to have. I mean, is this racism based on skin color? Is this something that social scientists call cultural racism? And I think it's a bit of both. But Muslims are racialized. Now, a common response I hear to that, so I'll just try to head that question off if it comes from anybody, is, well, Muslims are not a race. And trust me, if there's anyone who knows that Muslims are not a race, it's Muslims. But they are racialized. They are viewed as a race. They are essentialized. They are grouped together as sort of this coherent whole, right, that are plugged into one common source. It's sort of my matrix theory, right? All Muslims are plugged into the matrix. All people who have that skin color, that ancestry, are plugged into one sort of system, and they download the same program, and they're all the same, and therefore we must treat them the same. In Europe, you'll get a little bit more complexity on the racism because, for example, in Britain, the immediate association is not between Muslim and Arab always, but between Muslim and South Asian. Because many people who are Muslim in Britain come from the former British Empire, Pakistan, this Indian subcontinent, basically. So in the Western nations, that can get complexified, but it's still racism. And scholars of Islamophobia do debate to what degree this is a form of racism, and how Muslims are racialized, and how do you respond to that, and how can you learn from other forms of racism and the civil rights sort of movements that have been responding to those. Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. So my question is, religions in general, there are many different interpretations of them. Throughout any religion's history, there have been violent and peaceful interpretations followed by periods of peace and war.
Correct.
Like any religion, or even Buddhism in Burma, there's a violent sect that's actually killing Muslims. With Islam right now, and I think this is kind of contributing to the rise of Islamophobia, is the fact that right now it has kind of been co-opted and dominated by Saudi Arabia, who has exported their own version, which is a violent interpretation. Because in the Quran, there are both passages that can be interpreted as calls to arms and violence and action, and passages that are calls to peace, and the document kind of intentionally contradicts itself. That's part of how it was written. But do you think that the fact that Saudi Arabia and in general Islamic theocracies, have they contributed also to the rise of Islamophobia, not just Americans and foreign nationals criticizing Islam, but the actions of states carrying out human rights abuses, not only in the name of Islam, and like, for example, they made their own convention on human rights that affirms Islamic supremacy and blocks multiple, I guess, basic fundamental rights such as freedom of speech, association. It separates Muslims and non-Muslims in social classes. So my question is could that also contribute to the rise of Islamophobia?
Yeah. If the question were, do some of these movements, these extremist ideologies, have some very concrete sources in certain regions, such as in Saudi Arabia, right? Certain versions of Salafi Islam, that it's fair to be critically engaging and to criticize in terms of some of the influence they might have on groups like Al-Qaeda and whatnot. Yeah, that's a fair conversation, I think, to have. I will never go to the path of saying that Muslims themselves are responsible for prejudice against them. And here's why. Even in that case, again, the legitimate critique is towards those for who are the origins of this, right? But then to take that and make the move to, therefore, I should be suspicious of 1.6 billion people.
I wasn't saying that. No,
Yeah.
I was saying that there is a very small group, I guess, just
Right.
quite simply ruining it for everybody else.
Sure.
American Muslims, for the overwhelming majority, especially of American Muslims, are not peaceful and do not, or are peaceful and do not follow
Yes.
the Salafi, Wahhabi doctrines. But there are efforts to get that in the United States, which in some ways I think we should counter, like fundraising transparency, because they do try, like, they do go through some proxy organizations, especially, for instance, the Kings of Saudi Arabia. But like around, like especially in Saudi Arabia, like there are a lot of people who believe this, and in some ways it levels not a criticism against Islam, but definitely a criticism against the interpretation.
Sure.
And like the fact that it's the only religion that has theocracies today. Every religion has had theocracies.
Mm-hmm.
They're all gone. So.
Well, and you got to keep in mind that in most of these countries you're talking about, including particularly Saudi Arabia, these are not democratic countries.
Yes.
So we're not talking about grassroots movements to instill these political orders, correct? And we do have Gallup polls suggesting that there are many Muslims who would be in favor of democracy. In fact, in most majority countries, in many cases, they look to the United States. This is one of the things they like about the U.S. is democracy. They just have a problem with our foreign policy and that we're not consistent in supporting democracy elsewhere. Very inconsistent in that front, right? So again, it's who are we talking about? Are we talking about Muslims, or are we talking about certain regimes? But we're not talking about a political institution in this case that has been produced by democratic movements. So the idea that this is sort of inherent in Islam, I mean I
guess there's a political, Islam is a religion with a political aspect. There's a political kind of
absolutely, as are every other religion ever, right? Including Christianity. That's not unique to Islam. And the history of Christianity in the United States, the history of Christianity in Europe are infused with political orientations and political agendas. I would argue that Christianity in the United States, there's still that element that's pretty strong. And it has been particularly since the 1970s. Yep. So this is where that move again. It's okay to engage in the critique of the Saudi Arabian government, for example. Although ironically, the United States government supports it, right? Which is a question about our own commitment to democracy, is it not?
Right.
Yeah. But a lot of Islamophobia can come into play when we then pretend like, well, then that has nothing to do with our past or our present, and that's the move we don't want to make, I think. But thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. I want to be mindful of your time, so maybe just a few more questions. Three more questions. Yeah.
I'd like to thank you for coming.
Sure.
And I would like to start by making a statement, and then I do actually have a follow-up question. The statement goes to the gentleman who spoke at the very first beginning. Assalamu alaikum means peace upon you. And we say it when we enter houses to show greetings and respect to the person who's coming in. Sir, let me tell you, that was one of the least peaceful moments of my life when you're at that podium. But I would also like to point that in Sharia law, we have one of our fundamental establishments is forgiveness. So I forgive you for not knowing me as a Muslim and changing your perspective on who I am. Now for my question. From your kind of reasons of why people may develop an Islamophobia fear, you mentioned this concept of people being in the learning position, and I do believe that. I do believe humans, as they go through this life until the day they die, they should be updating their information. I also acknowledge the fact that you may, in your life, made a human being, a group of people that gives you fear, and thus you generalize that fear upon that group that they fall into. My question to you is kind of a hard question, but how do you get out of that? How do I make that person to see more, to update more, to meet me, to know that I'm just as a Muslim, I'm not wearing a scarf, I'm not oppressed? How do I do that?
Right. This is a hard question in many ways because I typically am very reticent to tell Muslims how they should combat Islamophobia, not because I don't think Muslims can be a part of this, but because I don't see Muslims as the source of it. Brief story, I was once on a college campus meeting with an MSA, Muslim Student Association, and a young African-American Muslim woman was in there, and she was grateful I came to speak on campus, but she said, no offense, Dr. Green, but I hope you get your people in the line. Go off, that's your right? So I feel a pretty heavy burden and responsibility. But of course, the more I get to know Muslims, an honor as well to try to bridge that gap and build those bridges. So I don't think you should feel like that you have a special burden upon you because if you self-identify as Muslim, you be yourself, you be you. And the rest of us who in the majority population need to get our act together, right? And then learn from you on how we can best be allies and build these larger bridges. But in the end, being yourself. And if you're not accepted as yourself, then yeah, that could end up into a worst case scenario, the kind of stuff we have here. But we're at a time now where I think a lot of Muslims feel an extra burden to do just that, to sort of be the bridge, right? Problem is you're 1% of the population. So this is like me saying, okay, everyone in here is not Muslim, go make a Muslim friend, but there's probably not a whole lot of Muslims around, so good luck, right? You're going to have 10. And I don't want it to be tokenism, right? And the relationships I'm talking about, this is more than a cup of coffee. This is, it takes years to develop these sort of relationships. My hope is that you're part of a community, and I think you are, an institution that values you, that gives you a place where you can flourish. And then that the rest of us do our best to make that sort of atmosphere continue to happen. And it's to everyone else that I would say that it's time for us to step up and to speak out. One of the reasons this movement has become so effective is that many of us, and I say this even of religion scholars, we have ceded the public sphere to this industry. We have ceded the narrative of Islam. Muslims are often ignored by the media anyway. And then you have religious scholars who have the credentials to push back on this, but for a variety of reasons I can't go into, higher education institutions, we struggle to value public scholarship and engaging in the public sphere on these great moral questions. So we have ceded this all to Robert Spencer. And that's why they're in the position they are now. That's why we have the setup where he's now going to be on campus, and we have to deal with that, right? But more of us who are allies or want to be allies, we need to step up our game. We need to speak out more. We need to be more courageous. And we need to be better friends, better colleagues, better classmates to you. And I know that's a cop-out to your question. I have always just had some difficulty telling Muslims, this is what you should. Anymore, if I were going to synagogue, I wouldn't be comfortable saying, here what you Jews need to be doing to combat anti-Semitism. I'm pretty sure I get an earful. Wait a second, anti-Semitism is not our responsibility, it's yours. And so I feel like asking the question the other way around, what should I be doing differently, better? Better than I've done tonight, what can, I won't be here tomorrow, but what can your colleagues and friends be doing better to help you and others who are Muslim feel like this is a safe environment where you can flourish? Thank you.
for our college president, Dr. Dan Gordon-Hicks. I debated asking, I know that you're a graduate of this college yourself, and I debated asking how you would feel if you were in our position, but then I realized that Donald Trump wasn't the president then, it was a different circumstance, so I'm not going to ask that. I'm going to actually quote you in your message to campus the day after Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. And in it, you stated that one of the core values of our mission statement and our institution is the conviction that a residential college best promotes the sense of community central to a liberal arts education in which personal relationships between students, faculty, and staff can flourish. And my question is, how do you expect us to flourish in fear?
Thank you for the question, and thank you to Todd Green for being here. I do want to remind you that this was part of the deal this week. It's not to have one speaker here, but to have someone here who I hope is providing all of you with a toolbox to respond to what's coming next. That was the point of having this event tonight. I am not interested in cultivating, I've lost my person asking the question. Where'd you go? There you go. I am obviously not interested in cultivating a community of fear. I see Jerome sitting next to you, who I know is working to put together a gathering at the same time as Spencer is here on Wednesday night. I'm sure all of you have heard about that. If you haven't, here's your advertisement. That is a way to come together. My understanding, Jerome, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not about protesting this speaker so much as demonstrating solidarity with the Muslim members of this community. My fantasy is we'll have 4 or 5 people sitting in the room with Robert Spencer, and we'll have the other 25 members of this community with Jerome and his rally. I think that's what we can do to counter the fear that a speaker like this might bring to this community. Thank you very much.
Last question. You're it, yeah.
You mentioned before about the financial motivations behind this professional Islamophobia, and I was kind of wondering, getting speculations on the motivations behind the funders that are funding this Islamophobia and what might be driving their policies.
Right. Well, the short answer to that, in terms of, okay, you got the funding, but then there's people giving it, and they want something too, right? They want something from Robert Spencer, they want something from AFDI. And a lot of times those main donors, like I listed the main 8, they are funding multiple projects, right? So they're not just giving all their money to AFDI, they might fund 3 or 4. It can depend, but one of the common threads I have found is usually a certain position on the politics when it comes to Israel. Not only pro-Israel, but not so compromising the Palestinians, not so recognizing of their rightful place in the government. 1 or 2 state solutions, right? It is a very conservative understanding of what the United States' position should be on Israel, and one way to get at that is to develop a narrative of Islam that paints those who are Muslim, which would include many Palestinians, not all, as sort of inherently enemies not only of Israel, but the enemies of the friends of Israel, allies of Israel, which would include the United States. So that is one of them. But more broadly speaking, this is, and I mean, there's financial sort of motivations, but this is political. This is about political leverage. They're either directly or indirectly wanting some sort of influence in policy making, whether it's domestic or foreign. And that's true of these people themselves, right? So the quote about earlier from Steve Bannon, and now we have people like Geller and Spencer who have the ear of someone like Bannon. Bannon has the ear of the President of the United States. And this would have been just incomprehensible a decade ago. These really were fringe figures. And not even this sort of like, within the conservative political movement, they were fringe figures, right? Sometimes getting disinvited from CPAC and other sorts of events. So, but things have changed in the past decade, particularly since 2010. And when it boils down to it, there's financial motivations, there's also political leverage. And one thing I hope you get out of this, even though it was kind of just a bird's eye view of this industry, is that they are succeeding in that they do have some say in policy. That executive order on the Muslim ban, I assure you, Donald Trump did not dream that up himself. He has some help, all right? And that's what you need to take seriously as we move forward and try to combat this narrative, is the political influence that they're having as well, not just the other stuff with hate crimes and whatnot. Thank you for your question. Thank all of you for the night. And for your hospitality.
I just wanted to make a quick response comment to President Briggs's advertisement, the possible, what's supposed to be a really nice first step after this event. One of solidarity, love, and peace. This is something that I picked up on my own. This is something that your fellow Muslim students, faculty, and staff have been quite involved in. And so be aware of that. In regards to what you plan to do, Wednesday night, I know it's last week of last working week of classes, but be aware of that quite a few of your Muslim students, staff, and faculty are calling upon you to celebrate peace, love, and solidarity with them. Wednesday, 7 p.m., hopefully outside of Penn Hall, which is the symbolic center of this campus. It's, weather permits, it might rain, so.